The sun existing before the world they called Creator, Tumu, Atumu, and our earthly son they called Kopri, He who is. Tumu was a man crowned and clothed with the insignia of supreme power, a true king of gods, majestic and impressive as the pharaohs who succeeded each other upon the throne of Egypt. The conception of Kopri as a disk enclosing a scarabaeus, or a man with a scarabus upon his head, or a scarabus-headed mummy, was suggested by the accidental alliteration of his name and that of Kopiru, the scarabus. The difference between the possible forms of the god was so slight as to be eventually lost altogether. His names were grouped by twos and threes in every conceivable way, and the scarabus of Kopri took its place upon the head of Ra, while the hawk headpiece was transferred from the shoulders of Harmakhutiti to those of Tumu. The complex beings resulting from these combinations, Ra Tumu, Atumu Ra, Ra Tumu Kopri, Ra Harmakhuit Tumu, Tumu Harmakhuit Kopri, never attained to any pronounced individuality. They were as a rule simple duplicates of the feudal god, names rather than persons, and though hardly taken for one another indiscriminately, the distinctions between them had reference to mere details of their functions and attributes. Hence arose the idea of making these gods into embodiments of the main phases in the life of the sun during the day and throughout the year. Ra symbolized the sun of springtime and before sunrise, Harmakhuiti the summer and the morning sun, Atumu the sun of autumn and of afternoon, Kopri that of winter and of night. The people of Heliopolis accepted the new names and the new forms presented for their worship, but always subordinated them to their beloved Ra. For them, Ra never ceased to be the god of the nome, while Atumu retained the god of the theologians, and was invoked by them. The people preferred Ra. At Thinis and at Sebenitos, Anhuri incurred the same fate as befell Ra at Heliopolis. After he had been identified with the sun, the similar identification of Shu inevitably followed. Of old, Anhuri and Shu were twin gods, incarnations of sky and earth. They were soon but one god in two persons, the god Anhuri Shu, of which the one half under the title of Anhuri represented, like Atumu, the primordial being, and Shu, the other half, became, as his name indicates, the creative sun god who upholds Shu, the sky. Turnu, then, rather than Ra, was placed by the Heliopolitan priests at the head of their cosmogony as supreme creator and governor. Several versions were current as to how he had passed from inertia into action, from the personage of Tumu into that of Ra. According to the version most widely received, he had suddenly cried across the waters, "Come unto me!" and immediately the mysterious lotus had unfolded its petals, and Ra had appeared at the edge of its open cup as a disk, a newborn child, or a disk-crowned sparrowhawk. This was probably a refined form of a ruder and earlier tradition, according to which it was upon Ra himself that the office had devolved of separating Sibu from Nuit, for the purpose of constructing the heavens and the earth. But it was doubtless felt that so unseemly an act of intervention was beneath the dignity even of an inferior form of the suzerain god. Shu was therefore borrowed for the purpose from the kindred cult of Anhuri, and at Heliopolis, as at Sebenitos, the office was entrusted to him of seizing the sky goddess and raising her with outstretched arms. The violence suffered by Nuit at the hands of Shu led to a connection of the Osirian dogma of Mendes with the solar dogma of Sebenitos, and thus the tradition describing the creation of the world was completed by another, explaining its division into deserts and fertile lands. Sibu, hitherto concealed beneath the body of his wife, was now exposed to the sun. Osiris and Sit, Isis and Nephthys, were born, and falling from the sky, their mother, onto earth, their father. They shared the surface of the latter among themselves. Thus the Heliopolitan doctrine recognized three principal events in the creation of the universe: the dualization of the supreme god and the breaking forth of light, the raising of the sky and the laying bare of the earth, the birth of the Nile and the allotment of the soil of Egypt, all expressed as the manifestations of successive deities. Of these deities, the latter ones already constituted a family of father, mother, and children, like human families. Learned theologians availed themselves of this example to effect analogous relationships between the rest of the gods, combining them all into one line of descent. As Atumu Ra could have no fellow, he stood apart in the first rank, and it was decided that Shu should be his son, whom he had formed out of himself alone, on the first day of creation, by the simple intensity of his own virile energy. Shu, reduced to the position of divine son, had in his turn begotten Sibu and Nuit, the two deities which he separated. Until then he had not been supposed to have any wife, and he also might have brought his own progeny into being, but lest a power of spontaneous generation equal to that of the demiurge should be ascribed to him, he was married, and the wife found for him was Tafnuit, his twin sister, born in the same way as he was born. This goddess, invented for the occasion, was never fully alive, and remained, like Nephthys, a theological entity rather than a real person. The texts describe her as the pale reflex of her husband. Together with him she upholds the sky, and every morning receives the newborn sun as it emerges from the mountain of the east. She is a lioness when Shu is a lion, a woman when he is a man, a lioness-headed woman if he is a lion-headed man. She is angry when he is angry, appeased when he is appeased. She has no sanctuary wherein he is not worshipped. In short, the pair made one being in two bodies, or to use the Egyptian expression, one soul in its two twin bodies. Hence we see that the Heliopolitans proclaimed the creation to be the work of the sun god, Atumu-Ra, and of the four pairs of deities who were descended from him. It was really a learned variant of the old doctrine that the universe was composed of a sky god, Horus, supported by his four children and their four pillars. In fact, the four sons of the Heliopolitan cosmogony, Shu and Sibu, Osiris and Sit, were occasionally substituted for the four older gods of the houses of the world. This being premised, attention must be given to the important differences between the two systems. At the outset, instead of appearing contemporaneously upon the scene, the four children of Horus, the four Heliopolitan gods who were deduced one from another, and succeeded each other in the order of their birth. They had not that uniform attribute of a supporter, associating them always with one definite function, but each of them felt himself endowed with faculties and armed with special powers required by his condition. Ultimately they took to themselves goddesses, and thus the total number of beings working in different ways at the organization of the universe was brought up to 9. Hence they were called by the collective name of the Ennead, the 9 gods, Pauit Nitiru, and the god at their head was entitled Pauiti, the god of the Ennead. When creation was completed, its continued existence was ensured by countless agencies with whose operation the persons of the Ennead were not at leisure to concern themselves, but had ordained auxiliaries to preside over each of the functions essential to the regular and continued working of all things. The theologians of Heliopolis selected 18 from among the innumerable divinities of the feudal cults of Egypt, and of these they formed 2 secondary Enneads, who were regarded as the offspring of the Ennead of the creation. The first of the 2 secondary Enneads, generally known as the Minor Ennead, recognized as chief Harsiessus, the son of Osiris. Harsiessus was originally an earth god who had avenged the assassination of his father and the banishment of his mother by Sit, that is, he had restored fullness to the Nile and fertility to the Delta. When Harsiessus was incorporated into the solar religions of Heliopolis, his filiation was left undisturbed as being a natural link between the 2 Enneads, but his personality was brought into conformity with the new surroundings into which he was transplanted. He was identified with Ra through the intervention of the older Horus, Haoriris, Harmachis, and the minor Ennead, like the great Ennead, began with the sun god. This assimilation was not pushed so far as to invest the younger Horus with the same powers as his fictitious ancestor. He was the son of earth, the everyday sun, while Atumu-Ra was still the sun pre-mundane and eternal. Our knowledge of the 8 other deities of the Minor Ennead is very imperfect. We see only that these were the gods who chiefly protected the sun god against its enemies and helped it to follow his regular course. Thus Haruditi, the Horus of Edfu, spear in hand, pursues the hippopotami or serpents, which haunt the celestial waters and menace the god. The progress of the sunbark is controlled by the incantations of thought, while Ua-Pua-Itu, the dual jackal god of Siuk, guides and occasionally tows it along the sky from south to north. The third Ennead would seem to have included among its members Anubis the jackal, and the 4 funerary genii, the children of Horus, Hapi, Amsit, Tiamat, Kabsonef, It further appears as though its office was the care and defence of the dead sun, the sun by night, as the second Ennead had charge of the living sun. Its functions were so obscure and apparently so insignificant as compared with those exercised by the other Enneads, that the theologians did not take the trouble either to represent it or to enumerate its persons. They invoked it as a whole, after the two others, in the formulas in which they called into play all the creative and preservative forces of the universe. But this was rather as a matter of conscience, and from love of precision than out of any true deference. At the initial impulse of the Lord of Heliopolis, the three combined Enneads started the world and kept it going, and gods whom they had not incorporated were either enemies to be fought with, or mere attendants. The doctrine of the Heliopolitan Ennead acquired an immediate and a lasting popularity. It presented such a clear scheme of creation, and one whose organization was so thoroughly in accordance with the spirit of tradition, that the various sacerdotal colleges adopted it one after another, accommodating it to the exigencies of local patriotism. Each placed its own nome god at the head of the Ennead as the god of the nine, the god of the first time, creator of heaven and earth, sovereign ruler of men, and lord of all action. As there was the Ennead of Atumu at Heliopolis, so there was that of Anhuri at Thinis and at Sebenidos, that of Minu at Coptos and at Panopolis, that of Heroris at Edfu, that of Sabku at Ambos, and later that of Ptah of Memphis and Ammon at Thebes. Nomes which worshipped a goddess had no scruples whatever in ascribing to her the part played by Atumu, and in crediting her with the spontaneous maternity of Shu and Tafnuit. Nit was the source and ruler of the Ennead of Sais, Isis that of Buto, and Hathor that of Dendera. Few of the sacerdotal colleges went beyond the substitution of their own feudal gods for Atumu. Provided that the god of each nome held the rank of supreme lord, the rest mattered little, and the local theologians made no change in the order of the other agents of creation, their vanity being unhurt even by the lower offices assigned by the Heliopolitan tradition to such powers as Osiris, Sibu, and Sit, who were known and worshipped throughout the whole country. End of section 15. Chapter 2. The Gods of Egypt, Part 8. The theologians of Hermopolis alone decided to borrow the new system just as it stood, and in all its parts. Hermopolis had always been one of the ruling cities of Middle Egypt. Standing alone in the midst of the land lying between the eastern and western Mies, it had established upon each of the two great arms of the river a port and a custom house, where all boats travelling either up or down stream paid toll on passing. Not only the corn and natural products of the valley and of the delta, but also goods from distant parts of Africa brought to Siuf by Sudanese caravans, helped to fill the treasury of Hermopolis. Thought, the god of the city, represented as ibis or baboon, was essentially a moon god, who measured time, counted the days, numbered the months, and recorded the years. Lunar divinities, as we know, are everywhere supposed to exercise the most varied powers. They command the mysterious forces of the universe, they know the sounds, words, and gestures by which these forces are put in motion, and not content with using them for their own benefit, they also teach to their worshippers the act of employing them. He had discovered the incantations which evoke and control the gods. He had transcribed the texts and noted the melodies of these incantations. He recited them with that true intonation, ma kruo, which renders them all-powerful, and every one, whether god or man, to whom he imparted them, and whose voice he made true, sma kruo, became like himself master of the universe. He had established the creation not by muscular effort, to which the rest of the cosmogonical gods primarily owed their birth, but by means of formulas, or even of the voice alone, the first time when he awoke in the new. In fact, the articulate word and the voice were believed to be the most potent of creative forces, not remaining immaterial on issuing from the lips, but condensing, so to speak, into tangible substances, into bodies which were themselves animated by creative life and energy, into gods and goddesses who lived or created in their turn. By a very short phrase, Tumu had called forth the gods who order all things, for his "Come unto me," uttered with a loud voice upon the day of creation, had evoked the sun from within the lotus. Thought had opened his lips, and the voice which proceeded from him had been an entity. Sound had solidified into matter, and by a simple emission of voice the four gods who presided over the four houses of the world had come forth alive from his mouth, without bodily effort on his part, and without spoken evocation. Creation by the voice is almost as great a refinement of thought as the substitution of creation by the word for creation by muscular effort. In fact, sound bears the same relation to words that the whistle of a quartermaster bears to orders for the navigation of a ship transmitted by a speaking trumpet. It simplifies speech, reducing it, as it were, to a pure abstraction. At first it was believed that the Creator had made the world with a word, then that he had made it by sound, but further conception of his having made it by thought does not seem to have occurred to the theologians. It was narrated at Hermopolis, and the legend was ultimately universally accepted, even by the Heliopolitans, that the separation of Nuit and Cebu had taken place at a certain spot on the site of the city where Cebu had ascended the mound on which the feudal temple was afterwards built, in order that he might better sustain the goddess and uphold the sky at the proper height. The conception of a creative council of 5 gods had so far prevailed at Hermopolis, that from this fact the city had received in remote antiquity the name of the House of 5. Its temple was called the Abode of 5 down to a late period in Egyptian history, and its prince, who was the hereditary high priest of thought, reckoned as the first of his official titles that of Great One of the House of 5. The 4 couples who had helped Atumu were identified with the 4 auxiliary gods of thought, and changed the Council of 5 into a great Hermopolitan Ennead, but at the cost of strange metamorphoses. However artificially they had been grouped about Atumu, they had all preserved such distinctive characteristics as prevented their being confounded one with another. When the universe which they had helped to build was finally seen to be the result of various operations demanding a considerable manifestation of physical energy, each god was required to preserve the individuality necessary for the production of such efforts as were expected of him. They could not have existed and carried on their work without conforming to the ordinary conditions of humanity. Being born one of another, they were bound to have paired with living goddesses as capable of bringing forth their children as they were of begetting them. On the other hand, the 4 auxiliary gods of Hermopolis exercised but one means of action, the voice. Having themselves come forth from the Master's mouth, it was by voice that they created and perpetuated the world. Apparently they could have done without goddesses, had marriage not been imposed upon them by their identification with the corresponding gods of the Heliopolitan Ennead. At any rate, their wives had but a show of life, almost destitute of reality. As these 4 gods worked after the manner of their master, Thought, so they also bore his form and reigned along with him as so many baboons. When associated with the Lord of Hermopolis, the 8 divinities of Heliopolis assumed the character and the appearance of the 4 Hermopolitan gods in whom they were merged. They were often represented as 8 baboons surrounding the supreme baboon, or as 4 pairs of gods and goddesses without either characteristic attributes or features, or finally as 4 pairs of gods and goddesses, the gods being, as far as we are able to judge, the couple Nu-Nuit answers to Shu-Tafnuit, Hahu-Hehit to Sibu and Nuif, Kaku-Kakit to Osiris and Isis, Ninu-Ninit to Sit and Nephthys. There was seldom any occasion to invoke them separately. They were addressed collectively as the 8, Kumunu, and it was on their account that Hermopolis was named Kumunu, the city of the 8. Ultimately they were deprived of the little individual life still left to them, and were fused into a single being to whom the texts refer as Kunuminu, the god 8. By degrees the Ennead of thought was thus reduced to 2 terms: take part in the adoration of the kings. According to a custom common towards the Greco-Roman period, the sculptor has made the feet of his gods like jackals' heads. It is a way of realizing the well-known metaphor which compares a rapid runner to the jackal roaming around Egypt. As the sacerdotal colleges had adopted the Heliopolitan doctrine, so they now generally adopted that of Hermopolis, Ammon, for instance, being made to preside indifferently over the 8 baboons, and over the 4 independent couples of the primitive Ennead. In both cases the process of adaptation was absolutely identical, and none would have been attended by no difficulty whatever, had the divinities to whom it was applied only been without family. In that case, the one needful change for each city would have been that of a single name in the Heliopolitan list, thus leaving the number of the Ennead unaltered. But since these deities had been turned into triads, they could no longer be primarily regarded as simple units. to be combined with the elements of some one or other of the Enneads without preliminary arrangement. The two companions whom each had chosen had to be adopted also, and the single thought, or single atumu, replaced by the three patrons of the nome, thus changing the traditional 9 into 11. Happily, the constitution of the triad lent itself to all these adaptations. We have seen that the Father and the Son became one and the same personage, whenever it was thought desirable. We also know that one of the two parents always so far predominated as almost to efface the other. Sometimes it was the goddess who disappeared behind her husband, sometimes it was the god whose existence merely served to account for the offspring of the goddess, and whose only title to his position consisted in the fact that he was her husband. Two personages thus closely connected were not long in blending into one, and were soon defined as being two faces, the masculine and the feminine aspects of a single being. On the other hand, the Father was one with the Son, and on the other he was one with the Mother. Hence the Mother was one with the Son as with the Father, and the three gods of the triad were resolved into one God in three persons. Thanks to this subterfuge, to put a triad at the head of an Ennead was nothing more than a roundabout way of placing a single God there. The three persons only counted as one, and the 11 names only amounted to the 9 canonical divinities. Thus the Theban Ennead of Amun Mat Kansu, Shu, Tafnuit, Sibu, Nuit, Osiris, Isis, Sit, and Nephthys, is, in spite of its apparent irregularity, as correct as the typical Ennead itself. In such Enneads Isis is duplicated by goddesses of like nature, such as Hathor, Selkit, Taninit, and yet remains but one, while Osiris brings in his son Horus, who gathers about himself all such gods as play the part of divine son in other triads. The theologians had various methods of procedure for keeping the number of persons in an Ennead at 9, no matter how many they might choose to embrace in it. Supernumeraries were thrown in like the shadows at Roman suppers, whom guests would bring without warning to their host, and whose presence made not the slightest difference either in the provision for the feast or in the arrangements for those who had been formally invited. Thus remodeled at all points, the Ennead of Heliopolis was readily adjustable to sacerdotal caprices, and even profited by the facilities which the triad afforded for its natural expansion. In time, the Heliopolitan version of the origin of Shu Tafnuit must have appeared too primitively barbarous. Allowing for the license of the Egyptians during pharaonic times, the concept of the spontaneous emission whereby Aturnu had produced his twin children was characterized by a superfluity of coarseness which it was at least unnecessary to employ, since by placing the god in a triad, this double birth could be duly explained in conformity with the ordinary laws of life. The solitary Aturnu of the more ancient dogma gives place to Aturnu the husband and father. He had indeed 2 wives, Iusuit and Nebthapit, but their individualities were so feebly marked that no one took the trouble to choose between them. Each passed as the mother of Shu and Tafnuit. This system of combination, so puerile in its ingenuity, was fraught with the gravest consequences for the history of Egyptian religions. Shu, having been transformed into the divine son of the Heliopolitan triad, could henceforth be assimilated with the divine sons of all those triads which took the place of Tumu at the head of provincial Enneads. Thus we find that Horus, the son of Isis at Buto, Ari Hasnofir, the son of Nit at Sais, Knumu, the son of Hathor at Esna, were each in turn identified with Shu, the son of Aturnu, and lost their individualities in his. Sooner or later this was bound to result in bringing all the triads closer together, and in their absorption into one another. Through constant reiteration of the statement that the divine sons of the triad were identical with Shu, as being in the second rank of the Ennead, the idea arose that this was also the case in triads unconnected with Enneads. In other terms, that the third person in any family of gods was everywhere and always Shu under a different name. It having been finally admitted in the sacerdotal colleges that Tumu and Shu, father and son, were one, all the divine sons were, therefore, identical with Tumu, the father of Shu, and as each divine son was one with his parents, it inevitably followed that these parents themselves were identical with Tumu. Reasoning in this way, Egyptians naturally tended towards that conception of the divine oneness to which the theory of the Hermopolitan Ogdoad was already leading them. In fact, they reached it, and the monuments show us that in comparatively early times the theologians were busy uniting in a single person the prerogatives which their ancestors had ascribed to many different beings. But this conception of deity towards which their ideas were converging has nothing in common with the conception of the God of our modern religions and philosophies. No god of the Egyptians was ever spoken of simply as God. Tumu was the one and only God, Nutu Uau Auiti at Heliopolis. Anhuri-Shu was also the one and only God at Sebennytos and at Thinis. The unity of Atunu did not interfere with that of Anhuri-Shu, but each of these gods, although the sole deity in his own domain, ceased to be so in the domain of the other. The feudal spirit, always alert and jealous, prevented the higher dogma which was dimly apprehended in the temples from triumphing over local religions and extending over the whole land. Egypt had as many sole deities as she had large cities, or even important temples. She never accepted the idea of the sole God, beside whom there is none other. End of chapter 2. End of section 16.